Well, very nice to see you all, and thank you for coming. So I thought when I was preparing the slides, what should I talk about? But there's just so much about this project, and it's spanned quite a lot of my life. You know, we're now in the 5th year, or probably more. So I've split it into two. The inspiration, sort of gathering all the evidence, all the talking to academics like Dr. Anna, doing all the travels, becoming the artist sponge and soaking up all of these things. So that's the first part. The second part is actually creating something. So without further ado, we'll make a start. You're going to hear little excerpts from William Bradford. He pops in and puts his penny's worth in a few times, so he'll be chatting to you. And there's a few videos. Now, some of them, they are loud, but it's so that you can feel a bit of the journey that I felt. So we'll make a start. So I first started off with looking locally and thinking about textures, textiles, intricate patterns, because that's what I'm quite fascinated with within my sculptures. Anything where I can make an intricate texture, something that'd be interesting for the viewer of a sculpture to touch and feel. Because I think we were discussing this in our public workshop upstairs today. You know, public art is one of the art forms that you're allowed to touch. And I get told off quite regularly when I go into galleries because I'm just so drawn to something, particularly sculpture, I just want to touch it, and they don't let you. So when a sculpture's out in the public realm, you can go ahead and you can touch it, and that just adds another dimension. So I'm often looking for things where I can add an interesting texture, a surface pattern, a quality to a sculpture that's going to be interesting. So I started off at the Industrial Museum, which was held in Nottingham's Woollerton Park. And they've got loads of machines, some working, some not, stretching from the 1600s right up into modern day, particularly around the textile industry. Everything from hand looms, bobbin lathes, to framework knitters, to actually mechanised lathes. So I spent quite a long time there. I think I was there for 4 weeks, having a look at some of these machines, some of the intricate patterns that they made. So whilst I was there, I was chatting to people as they visited. I'd set up my own little art space so people could come in and talk to me. I got to see some of the machines at work, like this one. Now, although this machine is not actually threaded up, it's not got any of the threads in there, the working parts are moving and you can hear that noise, and it just really helps when you go to somewhere like that, like living museums, to kind of put you into that time zone, to imagine, well, what would a room be like with 10 of those going off? You know, the sheer noise and trying to work and all these moving parts and the dust that it was kicking up. It really brings history to life. So having an artist residency in something like a museum is really great because I get to experience all of these extra elements. So whilst I was there, I was delving into the patterns and looking at interesting depictions of flora and fauna across some of the patterns in the lace archives that they've got there. And this started getting an idea forming that I quite liked these patterns and flora and fauna, and could this be something I looked at? The more I spoke, particularly with Dr. Anna, the more I found out about the Pilgrims and the Mayflower Travellers. And we were chatting earlier today about how we started, and I went with Anna to lots of schools while we made lanterns, and in the middle of each of the day we'd have this history chat. We'd have an interesting talk from Anna. We'd watch the horrible history song, their Pilgrim rap. You know, and it was fascinating hearing all of this history, and I started looking at William Bradford's diary, and I thought, well, how am I going to actually make a sculpture about all of these things that they're going through if I've got absolutely no experience of this at all? So I started thinking, well, could I experience it? And one of the passages was quite sort of hit home. It was talking about how William Bradford and his wife Dorothy decided that their small child wasn't old enough to make the voyage, so they decided to leave him behind and call for him later. I just thought, what would that have been like as a parent, to leave your loved ones behind and go off on this adventure? You can't contact them until you've got there. Would you get there? And so I started looking at the ship they were travelling on, the Mayflower. So it wasn't designed for people, it was a cargo ship. So I just thought, well, we still have those. We have cargo ships crossing all of the oceans every day. They may not be made out of wood, but their purpose is the same, to take cargo from A to B. Maybe I should go on one of those. So I had a bit of research, and I discovered that you could book passage on working freight ships. So I found a company. It's very difficult to find one. I had to sign a waiver to say if I popped my clogs at sea, that they'd be able to leave my remains at the nearest port, and my family would have to be responsible to fetch me back, because they didn't have a ship's doctor on board, which my mum was horrified at. My dad tried to buy me a ticket for a cruise ship, saying it's just the same, it's just the same. It's like, it's not the same. I need to experience as close to as the Pilgrim travellers as possible. So going on a working freight ship was as close as I could get to the Mayflower travellers. So you're going to hear now a bit of me reading from my diary about that first thought about going. And then William Bradford will add a little bit in to finish off.
Sunday, 28th of July. Today was supposed to be the sailing day, but the ship, Atlantic Sea, has been delayed. Bonus, I got to spend another day at home yesterday, which was really nice. Set off at 9:30 a.m. this morning, after hugging everyone. I felt like crying, but put a brave face on. I hope I'm doing the right thing. Travelled through a lot of rain, making our way towards Southport via the Peak District. Cat and Fiddle Road had very poor visibility and was very wet. Made it to the hotel for 2:30, checked in and looked at emails. Still no boarding pass for the ship or a timetable. Talk about last minute. Not like I'd booked the passage in January. Oh wait, I did. Took a walk with Dad down the pier, which was very blustery. The sea was out, showing vast mudflats and seagrass. I could just about see Liverpool to the left and Blackpool to the right. Went into the Victorian penny arcade, swapped £1 for some old pennies, and played a few games. Had my future told by Zoltar, who told me to follow my heart. Don't let fear stop you from doing what you want to do. Got the sailing times. It will dock at 8 p.m. tonight and depart at 7:30 p.m. Monday. They have estimated a much shorter sailing time of only 7 days. Let's hope for good weather. Still, no boarding ticket.
It is not with us as with other men, whom small things can discourage, or small discontentments cause to wish themselves home again.
So I think William and I both was feeling that pang of separation, of that preparation to get on board the ship, of delays, of nothing going quite right, of wait, will I get on it, won't I get on it, So it was quite nerve-wracking at that time. So it was quite nice that I could say goodbye to my family at home, and that my dad took me up to the docks, because I think maybe that would have been too painful to do it on the docks, to say goodbye. But I did put my brave face on, and I was prepared. I knew I would not be able to contact them at all until I landed, but I also didn't know when I was going to land, and they also told me at the last minute, oh, by the way, we can't drop you off in America, we're going to leave you in Canada, so you'll have to make your own way down to America. So at the last minute I had to find a very nice host on Airbnb who would agree for me to turn up at some point in a 4-day window. I wouldn't tell them when I'd turn up, I would just arrive on the doorstep at some point in 4 days and trust that I would turn up. So I found somebody who would take that risk, and I turned up on day 2. So once I'd eventually got a boarding pass, which came right at the last minute, then I was almost ushered into the room with the Spanish photographer because they thought we were a couple. And when we explained to the crew that no, we're not together, separate room, they showed me into my cabin. So it was quite interesting having a look and getting myself settled. So let's have a look around the cabin.
Hi, I've just boarded the ship, had a tour round, we've done the safety talk, and now I've just started to unpack. I noticed every single cupboard has a little lock. I think that's to stop things falling out with rough seas. Take a look at my room. So I've got a little cabin. Here's my wardrobe, desk, and the view out the window. Lots of containers being loaded.
So I'll hasten to add as well, that bed was the most uncomfortable bed I've ever slept on. It was like a board with a blanket on top. And luckily I wasn't sharing. So after the first night, it'd been really painful trying to get to sleep. I had just stripped everything off the other bed and piled it on top and tried to make a comfortable pad. And that was also referenced in William Bradford's diary about this sort of separating areas of the ship, trying to find places to sleep, hearing people throwing up next door when they got going, people making fun of people throwing up. Some things have not changed in 400 years. We're going to hear a bit now from William Bradford.
They went aboard and their friends with them, where truly doleful was the sight of that sad and mournful parting, to see what sighs and sobs and prayers did sound amongst them, what tears did gush from every eye, and pithy speeches pierced each heart.
So once we actually eventually got off to sea, which was delayed again and again, the first meal in the mess, the ship's captain came and said to us, we're so delayed, we're changing course. We're not going to go in a straight line, we're going to go up the globe and back down because it's faster to go up and back down. He said, but it will be rougher because we're going to go under Iceland. And boy, was it rough. Eventually, after about 4 days of very rough seas, it started to get a little gentler, only a little, and we were allowed outside. Now, these big doors, they're so heavy and they've got these handles that you have to turn. They said you have to take extra care because they've had people having fingers severed in windy conditions. So just to be careful when you go outside. So I'm going to take you on a little exploration of the ship. It is loud, but that's how loud the wind was. So hopefully it's not too loud for you sitting at the front.
My deck walk today is a little bit different. I'm hiding under the bridge because it's just so windy and raining. So I'm going to try and walk around to the bow and give you a taste of what it's like. Here we go, quite windy. You can see up ahead part of the captain's bridge that spans the whole width of the ship. Lifeboats and the emergency ladders, davit, and the little life vessel, rescue vessel. Prepare yourself, it's getting very windy. I'm going to go up to the next deck, see what it's like on top.
So it was quite interesting when we was able to get outside. You're only allowed on a very small area of the ship, Again, very similar to those on board the Mayflower, very little area to exercise. And sometimes the weather was just too bad to venture outside, so you were kind of stuck inside.
It's 7:30 p.m. now, and what was a sunny day has suddenly changed. All through dinner we got glimpses of Northern Ireland to the left and Scotland to the right. I put on my raincoat to walk the decks, and it was so windy it was hard to close the doors. I remembered the safety talk about keeping fingers away from the door edges, as it could sever fingers in windy conditions, and I held tightly to the handles. I made it from port to bow and then starboard deck to take in the last views of the British Isles. It suddenly worsened and I could not approach the bow anymore for fear of being blown around or not being able to open the doors. I'm back inside looking at the rain and wind and very surprised that the ship doesn't seem to be affected, but just a gentle, constant vibration of the engines. Looking over my weaving, which has not gone very well, I have some sketches of local lace that I made at the Industrial Museum in Nottingham. I've tried to translate it into a macrame piece, with very little success. I've been reading about the delays that the Pilgrims faced after leaving Leiden in July on board the Speedwell. They joined the Mayflower and the two ships left Southampton, only to discover that the Speedwell was as open and leaky as a sieve. The ships returned to port in Dartmouth for repairs and set off once more in mid-August. After 200 miles, yet more leaks from the Speedwell, so back to port again, this time in Plymouth. Finally, they set sail once more, but with everyone who wanted to continue aboard the one vessel, the Mayflower, on the 6th of September 1620. I'm so glad that my delays have not been as problematic as the ones encountered by the travellers 400 years ago. I will continue to read Nathaniel Philbrick's book, Mayflower, A Voyage to War, and my copy of Mort's Relation, a journal of the Pilgrims at Plymouth, to see what happens next.
So if you're interested in seeing some of the disastrous macrame pieces, they're upstairs in the exhibition. So after my journey across the sea, then my next port of call was to Harvard, and they'd kindly given me permission to go into their archives. So I really wanted to mirror what I'd done before I left by looking at the artworks in the Industrial Museum, but look at some of the artworks of the indigenous population, in particular the First Nations like the Wampanoag and Iroquois. And I found this lovely passage, and William Bradford will tell you himself, about their first encounter.
He very boldly came all alone, and along the houses straight to the rendezvous, where we intercepted him, not suffering him to go in, as undoubtedly he would, out of his boldness. He saluted us in English and bade us welcome, for he had learned some broken English among the Englishmen that came to fish at Monchigal. He was a man free in speech, so far as he could express his mind, and of a seemly carriage. He said he was not of these parts, but of Moratigon, and one of the Sagamores, or lords thereof, and had been 8 months in these parts. The wind beginning to rise a little, we cast a horseman's coat about him, for he was stark naked, only a letter about his waist, with a fringe about a span long. He had a bow and 2 arrows. He was a tall, straight man, the hair of his head black, long behind, none on his face at all. He told us the place where we now live is called Patuxet, and that about 4 years ago all the inhabitants died of an extraordinary plague, and there is neither man, woman, nor child remaining, as indeed we have found none, so as there is none to hinder our possession, or lay claim to it. All the afternoon we spent in communication with him.
I think what was really interesting for me, having just been at the Industrial Museum and studying all the frames and mechanised lathes, is the posture. He said that he was a very straight man, And all the research that I was doing before I left was talking about the posture of those sitting at the loom for 15 hours a day, that they were so bent. And I thought, well, would they have noticed that? Because I understand that in Leiden that there was a lot of textile industries there, and that some of them in fact was working in that industry. So did that jar because they was used to seeing people hunched over because of the industries that they worked in? But also because he didn't have very many clothes on either, that he noted that, which is really interesting. So what was amazing about going into the archives at Harvard is just being able to see up close some of these artifacts that they had, but also noticing some of the changes and the evidence of European bartering. So the piece on the left was this little pouch, and I thought at first they were bells, but they're not. They're European thimbles, and they've drilled a hole in and added them on. There's another piece, one of the sketches upstairs, which has a little cross on it. So you can see that there's that bartering and selling of different objects, and that the effect of the European travellers is filtering into their own handicrafts. So this is a lovely piece to leave in, because William Bradford describes a house that they discovered and what they would have lived in.
Whilst we were thus ranging and searching, 2 of the sailors, which were newly come on shore, by chance espied 2 houses which they had dwelt in, but the people were gone. The houses were made with long sapling trees, bended and both ends stuck in the ground. They were made round, like unto an arbour, and covered down to the ground with thick and well-wrought mats. And the door was not over a yard high, made of a mat to open. The chimney was a wide open hole in the top, for which they had a mat to cover it close when they pleased. One might stand and go upright in them. In the midst of them were 4 little trenches knocked into the ground, and small sticks laid over, on which they hung their pots. Round the fire they lay on mats, which are beds. The houses were double matted, for as they were matted without, so they were within, with newer and fairer mats.
I think reading these accounts as I was travelling in these different parts just really helped to bring it all to life. You know, so I'm there looking at artifacts that these people that he's describing have made, and just seeing some of the intricate details, and the fact that these are made out of tiny little beads that have also been fashioned from shells, and the skill it would have taken to get those tiny little beads, drill that little tiny hole in there as well. It was amazing just to get that opportunity to go and see them. So my next port of call was to go to Provincetown, and that's the very tip of Cape Cod, and that's where the Mayflower first set anchor. And there you can see this huge tower, and that's the Pilgrim Monument, and at the base of the tower is the Pilgrim Monument Museum. So I was artist in residence there for 2 weeks, which was really amazing, because I could do what I did in Nottingham and set up a little art studio. I could work away in there, talk to visitors, get them having a go and making. And when people are sitting making, then they often feel a bit more free to talk to you and ask questions. So a lot of people was asking what I was doing, where was the Midlands? You know, I thought they all come from Plymouth. Can you teach us some local sayings? So I was teaching some little children who were going around the museum going, hey up, me up, hey up, me up. So it was a really nice sort of exchange, and a lot of, I think the most thing that was evident, that people had got no idea that the origin stories began here. You know, that they all just assumed they'd all come from Plymouth. So I think it was really interesting on both sides having those conversations. So this next bit is William Bradford describing Cape Cod Bay. So I hopped over on a ferry, which didn't take long at all, but the bay is quite a big bay. So I'll let William describe it in his own words.
A good harbour and pleasant bay, circled round, except in the entrance, which is about 4 miles over from land to land, compassed about to the very sea with oaks, pines, juniper, sassafras, and other sweet wood, 'Tis a harbour wherein 1,000 sail of ships may safely ride.
So hopefully that can give you an idea of just how big that harbour is. So you can see there some of the many people at my weaving table. So we'd allocated enough for 200, and then by the time we'd reached 500, the museum said, I think you might need some more materials, so we quickly had to order some extras. I had over 600 visitors come and sit at the weaving table and have a go at making, and the museum was absolutely amazed at the sheer amount of people that got involved, and that it was a more gentler way to start talking about history and heritage and getting people involved. So it was a really amazing time, and I'm so glad that I made that journey. It was very difficult in a lot of parts, you know, to do that crossing, but I think what this gave me was a real sort of first-hand experience of that journey, and then I felt better equipped then to tackle what was going to come next. So before we go on to actually the making of the sculpture, I just want to see if there's any questions about the journey and the inspiration.
What was the cargo ship carrying?
Well, from what we saw, once we'd got a little calmer, then the ship's captain said, would you all like to have a tour? And we were like, yes, please. So we actually got to go around, and I discovered that you see these cargo ships with containers and you think that's pretty big stuff. That's the tiny stuff. The big stuff's on the inside. They've got cranes in there, yachts. They've got rock crushing machines. This tiny little MG car strapped to the floor next to this giant rock crushing machine. Then he opened this one door, a whole fleet of Range Rovers, as far as you could see. And so I asked him about, well, what's the strangest cargo you've ever taken? And he said some billionaire wanted to have some colours of paint for his private jet, but couldn't decide. So he had 7 of them shipped over, painted in different colours, so he could go and go, I'll have that one, and then they had to ship them all the way back. So there's all sorts on those ships, and it's just amazing just to see the sheer amount of stuff in them. I think my only disappointment was when we went into the engine room. I'd got that scene in Titanic in my head. I was imagining lots of dusty men, stripped to the waist, covered in coal dust, shoveling in, and instead there was all this shiny stainless steel and tubes, and everything was, you know, all computerized. There was nobody sort of getting their hands dirty. It was all spotless. So that was quite different, seeing the ship's engine, to what was in my mind.
One, like, to a little point, on one of the early shots of the deck, one side, I can't remember which, there was a square marked with numbers.
Yeah.
I think red numbers in circles. What are they for?
That's for when you've got to abandon ship.
I wondered.
Yes.
And so if you were top of the queue, you were number 1.
Yeah.
And what prioritised you then?
Yeah, I don't think the passengers, which they're only allowed to take 10, would get very much priority. But if you're interested in seeing quite a funny video, I mean, all of these are on my YouTube channel, but I took a video of me having to put the cold water suit on, which was quite hilarious, because the ship's captain said, you know, if you get in that water, you're dead within a few seconds. So this suit goes on top of your clothes, and it's an entire head to toe, like giant baby grow with all these things attached, but you have to practice getting in and out, because if you've got the wrong size, then it's going to be no good. But getting in it and fastening it up was quite a challenge. So go on YouTube and have a look at me gurning and going, oh, like this, and trying to get this costume on. But I think they really hammered it home. You have got to follow the safety procedures. And so once you've got that big red suit on, then you'd have to go and find your spot and stand on there and then wait for your turn to be taken off.
What nationality was the crew?
Filipino with a British captain and Scottish cadets. And interestingly, it was the Scottish cadets that were throwing up. So they were throwing up. They were quite embarrassed. It was their first voyage at sea and they couldn't stop being sick. So it was interesting.
So that cabin that you stayed in then, was
Yeah.
that only ever for like fare-paying passengers?
No, it's the same as the cruise.
Oh,
So they're just all the same. I hope the crew gets a bit more comfort on their beds, because I don't know how they manage. You know, they were so hard. But yeah, there was no difference. You know, same with the food. When the bell rang, if you didn't get into the mess and sit and eat your dinner, then that's it, you don't get none. So, and one of the funny things I was reading, William Bradford describing about their drinking, what they've got to drink, and they've got like a watered down ale, which was a clean, you know, source of something to drink, and how they started rationing it out to one flagon or something, one cup of beer a day. But interestingly, that's exactly what the passengers on the working ship, because it's a dry ship for sailors, but as a passenger you're allowed one alcoholic drink, and you tick the clipboard: red wine, white wine or beer. So I chose beer, so I got one ration of beer with each meal. Just like William Bradford, and like them, survived most of the journey on cabbage and taters. So.
Did you notice any difference between the skills of the children taking part in the weaving that were over in America compared to when you've done workshops here? Or was it about the same?
Well, I think it was not long after the loom band and what they call gimp weaving. They have got a very funny name for it, but they always really like, oh, I know how to do this. And it was, the kids were well away because they'd been doing loom banding, that craze went, and it was the adults, you know, and getting them to have a go. But you know, it was really interesting watching them. But yeah, I think the difference in language was interesting, you know. So there was a few words that they couldn't quite, well, we don't know what that is. So vice versa. Right, so the job was then how to take all of that journey, all of that research, all of those experiments, some that went right and some that went wrong, and create a sculpture out of that. So I really wanted to look at the females in the journey, and I noted that, you know, they didn't get very much mention. Even when poor Dorothy, you know, died, she got one sentence at the bottom of the page. You know, that there was very little mention about the women, yet there was pregnancies and births on the ship. You know, the ship, while it was on anchor at Provincetown, was turned almost into a hospital ship. So the women had a very important role, but they was not mentioned very much. So this was something that I was starting to think, well, this is something I want to unpick more. And did the women get any choice in the matter? So I sought the advice for some more historians, and found that, you know, at that period of time, that women were the property of men, father, and then on marriage, husband. And I think it was when I was looking at the archives at Nottingham University, I came across this word, paraphernalia. And that's what women were allowed to legally own, which was deemed of no interest to a man upon marriage, so she could keep it. It was all the bits and accoutrements and things that she might need, you know, but it was deemed no, you know, of no interest. So she was only allowed to have her paraphernalia, and that sort of made me think about the women. Did they get a choice in the matter? Did they have to just go because their dad was going, or husband? Or were they involved in that decision process? So I wanted to start to unpick that journey. So I started off by thinking about that woman, and it was a happy accident actually. I'd arranged to meet Anna at Gainsborough Old Hall, and we were meeting the manager there, and we were having a chat about the project, and I said that I'd got this book, Tudor Tailor, that I wanted to have an authentic costume made. And she was like, well, we have an historic stitching group, they might want to get involved. So before I knew it, we had then this whole group of stitchers who could hand stitch and make these garments. But I knew there was a few things that I needed to alter artistically. Now, first thing that you might notice when you go upstairs and have a look, the dress has got an extended train. They would not have worn that, but that's there for stability. Having that extra train, then it makes the sculpture a bit more stable, and it also allows me a bit more fabric to sculpt and look like the wind's flowing through her skirts. The other noticeable difference is that I wanted to reference the sort of working classes and their kirtles, so the piece that they'd wear over the top, they'd have to wear that at all times throughout all stages of life, pregnancy or not pregnancy. So that needed to be flexible and open. So the fastenings would often be at the front or the side to accommodate that change in the body. But also they don't have staff, so then they can't draw strings that at the back. However, I knew I wanted to decorate one of the kirtles, so the fastening had to go at the back. So on all of the Pilgrim Women, all their fastenings of their kirtles are on the back. And with each sculpture, so there's 3 in the series, starting with Pilgrim Woman Doncaster in the Danham Gallery in the centre of town. So she's the largest of the pilgrims, and she's got quite a lot of fancy adornments onto her dress. Then as you move across the counties and move into Gainsborough by the River Trent, then that fanciness is gone, and she's sort of thinking about that journey that's ahead of them. Then by the time we get to Boston, then the women there, their dresses are a little bit more ragged. They're at the end of their tether. They've gone through such a lot. They've had people snitching on them. They've had the militia after them. They've been thrown in jail here. They've been here just the clothes on their back, so that they're kind of at the end of their tether. So with each one, I could alter and adapt each one to suit that story of them travelling across the pilgrim routes areas, but also make them slightly different and engage the public in different ways. So Pilgrim Woman Doncaster, she has this decorative piece on the front of her kirtle, and you can see the development of that upstairs. So this was some of the macrame that I was working on, ideas on the ship, inspired by what I'd seen in Nottingham and in Harvard, trying to bring in that flora and fauna in the patterns. So this is the moment I came face to face with her at the foundry and got to see her for the first time. It's quite shocking to see a 6'5" version of yourself in bronze, and I walked around the corner and like, oh, there she is. Oh my God, she's massive. So this was me checking out, seeing everything, and she was never meant to be 6'5" either. So she was supposed to be my height. I'm 5'6", but they wrote the figures the wrong way round. When I've let them know at the Danham Gallery, can we accommodate 6'5"? And we had to measure the lifts. Oh gosh, only just. And because she's bigger, she's a bit more weighty. So she's at plus size, and she weighs nearly half a ton, which was, making sure we could get that in the museum safely without her falling through the floor. But it was a happy accident. I know. Could you imagine? She'd never get through the door. But interestingly, when quite often on this journey, we've got art imitating what's happened in history. The very moment that it was time to install Pilgrim Woman Doncaster, we're sat outside, we're waiting for the lorry to come for the foundry, and what happens is we get a gale. So, it makes me think of all the gales and hurricanes that the Mayflower travellers had. And there we have this 6'5", half-ton woman being lifted off the back of a lorry by a crane by her neck in the middle of a gale. So my first thought is, her head's going to pop off. Why are they lifting her there? But apparently it was the perfect centre of gravity to lift her. And I thought she's going to be smashing into the side of this new building. They've just spent all these millions on making this big, huge museum, and then there's going to be a pilgrim wedged into the side of it. But she serenely glided through the air as if she was weightless in the middle of this gale with everybody going, ah, landed perfectly on the trolley. And that's the great thing about working with Pangolin Editions Foundry. They are fantastic and work with you from everything from the ground up, and they're with you every step of the way. So let me give you a little guided tour of Pilgrim Woman Doncaster. And you can see some of the intricate details that we've managed to capture and add into the sculpture. So you can see that decorative piece You can see the Pilgrim 400 apple, which is a very special apple that I urge you to go and find out more about. You can see the bonnet and the headband to keep all the hair tucked out of the way. When my mum saw it for the first time, she didn't think it looked like me. She says, "Oh, it's not you, is it?" I went, "It is me." She said, "Well, it just doesn't look like you." And I think it's because of the bonnet and removing all the hair. And the design of this museum, they'd taken an old school for girls, they'd kept the facade and the staircase, knocked down the rest of the building, and then built this brand new facility all the way around it. And this alcove was perfect, and the colour of the tiles. So they actually, when I went for a site visit with my hard hat on and steel toe caps and high-vis vest when it was still a building site, I said, "Can I have one of those tiles so we can colour match?" And he gave me a great big brick. And they're not tiles, they are glazed bricks. But it meant then that we could colour match a beautiful colour to suit. And then people tell me in Doncaster that top left view is what they see at night time when the museum's closed. They've got these lights on in there, and all you can see is Pilgrim Woman looking outside as you go past. So there's Pilgrim Woman Doncaster. So with Pilgrim Woman Gainsborough, we wanted to reference the river, and I was talking with Anna about the use of the river to then use that to flee and get up to the Humber. So having it on the riverside was a really interesting positioning for the sculpture, but we weren't going to go for a large one with this one. So another way of making a sculpture larger and bringing them up so you've got that eye contact with them is the use of stone. And this was a beautiful piece of Ancaster weatherbed stone, so locally sourced in Ancaster. And it has this blue seam that runs through it. It's quite a shallow seam. So what the stonemason said is, well, let's turn it on its end. So we have that blue seam running through. And Anna provided these lovely words, which I just thought just worked so well. And people just happen upon it. And I've been sent some lovely photos. One in particular was when it was covered in frost, and they'd taken a picture of the back with all of her kirtle and all the stitches and the binds closing up her dress, all covered in frost. It was lovely. Incidentally, the installation of that sculpture was also plagued by another problem. So the first one, we had gales. So the second one, installing Pilgrim Gainsborough, I was a screen on a head, going left, right, yes, let's be right, because I had come down with COVID. So we had somebody, I think, from the council holding an iPad with my head on it. So they were on site, and I was lying down in bed going, yeah, let's have it, which we couldn't cancel cranes and things. It had to happen. So again, it was a very strange turn of events. So Pilgrim Woman Boston. So again, lockdown caused another problem because throughout this project had used macrame, but we had to then do everything remotely for Boston because we was in, there was a lot of restrictions. So then I turned to a different weaving, which was the lucet, and managed to design kits that would fit in a small box that could go through the post. So then the idea was that people could sign up for one of these kits. I made a tutorial so that I could sit with people in their own home but remotely. They would receive a kit through the post, they'd learn how to use the lucet, and then once they were confident with that braiding technique, they could use this very special piece of braid. So once they were confident with their braiding, they could braid a piece with their special cord and then put it in the prepaid envelope and send it back to me. So then I was able to add all of their artwork onto the sculpture and bound these two women together. So when you go and have a look, and you can see all the differences, because everybody, no matter, they're using the same technique and tool, they're all going to be quite different because everybody holds things and manipulates things differently. So if you'd like to find out more, and you've not had enough from this talk, there are lots of resources. So there are some leaflets in the room. So there is a podcast, so you can listen to all of my diary readings, you can hear me interview different academics and specialists, and William Bradford chats all the way through it too, so you can hear from him. There's also the Pilgrim Roots magazine, which you can access online. You can just scan the QR code and you can get the whole magazines for free. And I've contributed articles to all 3 of these publications. I think there's a 4th as well. So you can have a look on my website or on Pilgrim Roots website and check out some further reading. And you never know, you might be travelling on a freight ship next, going somewhere across the world. So, with that, thank you for listening, and I welcome any questions that you might have about the creation of any of the Pilgrim Women.
Yeah, what did you make your original ladies from, like, to get your pattern?
Yeah.
Before it was cast?
So it was me. So I was the shape, and then the ladies at Gainsborough Old Hall, they said they were going to use the draping method, so I had to stand there and they used me like a mannequin and drape the fabric on me. So once they'd dressed me head to toe and turned me into a pilgrim, and then we used something called photogrammetry. And what that is 160 cameras that are all connected together, so they all talk to one another, and they're all operated by one button. So you stand there surrounded by cameras and it captures that split second of that pose. But then what that gives you then is a digital version of yourself. And from there, then we can scale it up and down to our heart's content by using digital technologies. So it means you don't have to make a mould. So I wouldn't have to make a mould of me in my body. It's digitally captured. So that means that the dress that was made is upstairs, so you can see it. If we'd have used the other method, the dress would have been lost. You know, and it's quite possible to cast bodies. Anthony Gormley uses himself as his own model, but he has to stand in plaster cast with straws up his nose and his eyes taped closed. So I didn't have to do that. I had to be dressed in the Pilgrim Woman costume and then stand very still for them to then capture that split second. But then what that's enabled us to do is I've made a Pilgrim Woman that sits on a penny, and she's exactly the same as the 6'5" one in Doncaster, or the one that sits in Boston, or on the Riverside in Gainsborough. So having that digital element to these hand processors has meant then that it can change depending on where it's going. I can add things to it, like the decorative panels. I can take things away. So it gives you a lot more freedom as an artist to explore different things. So
when they cast the bronze though, what do they cast it into?
That's a good question. So once you've got that digital file and you're happy and you've set your scale, it's now they've got this polymer that behaves like wax. So they 3D print in this polymer. So if you're going to make a bronze sculpture, let's say you're going to make this mug. So first you'd need an impression of that mug. So you might have carved that in wood or moulded it in a bit of clay. So they'd put a mould around it and then open the mould. A bit like if you've been to Cadbury's World and you go round and see how they make the chocolate Easter eggs. Same process. You take the original out and then they can use that mould to fill with wax, swill it round like they do with the chocolate eggs, and then when they open the mould they've got a wax version of your mug. And then that wax then gets submerged in plaster, very similar to the plaster that you use when you break a limb, but this one's got a higher, it can withstand high temperatures. So whatever wax is inside, or 3D print is inside that plaster, then gets put inside a kiln and it's heated to 700 degrees. So anything that's in there with it, like some of the pieces I used that we cast the lucite braids that the people had sent me, that was cotton impregnated with wax. So it burnt away when it went into the kiln inside that plaster. So then when that plaster comes out the kiln, it's got an empty pocket in the shape of what was there, whether it was cotton or a 3D print or a piece of wax. And then you melt your metal, you pour it into the plaster, it finds all those voids and fills them up, and then you wait for it to go cold and you get a nice big hammer out and you smash away all the plaster, and what's inside is a bronze version of your sculpture. So there's a lot of processes that you go through to create a bronze, and it's a very lengthy process. Not all of it goes right. Sometimes you have to recast things. Sometimes things go wrong, or they blow up, or something else will happen. But that's the process of going from either an original or a person going into wax and then into bronze.
3D printers that we use then must be big.
No, they can segment because it's a digital file then. So they effectively cut me up into lots of bits and printed each bit and then each bit. So also upstairs is a little bit of the front of a kirtle at full size. So you can actually see one of those segments as a 3D print. So you can have a look at that.
So what, sorry, has anyone else want to ask me? What is inside those, you sitting on the, with your fellow woman sitting on side, on that stone there?
Yeah.
What is physically inside it, and what is physically inside, say, that big one in Doncaster?
The answer is nothing. They are hollow. All bronzes are hollow because if you had all of that void filled with bronze, A, they'd be extremely heavy, and B, nobody would be able to afford to have one. So all bronzes are hollow. So they think again about that Easter egg. Depending on how much chocolate Cadbury's put in and how much they swill it round, that determines how thick it's going to be. Exactly the same process is how much wax they put into that mould and swill it round, so they know.
Plastic goes around it and inside it?
No, because in some ways, yes, because they have that mould and they segment, then you've got that ability to then to have the inside and the outside. Yeah.
You mentioned the name of the foundry.
Yes.
What was it called?
Pangolin Editions Foundry.
Oh, the big one.
It is. So the owner of the foundry is he was born in South Africa, and it was inspired by the animal, a pangolin, and I'm quite often contacted by a lot of overseas foundries offering cheap casting, but for me, it's bronze casting is expensive. It costs a lot of money, but then you get a sculpture that's going to last lifetimes. But I think what you get by having a foundry that you can go and visit, it's that collaboration. If I have a question or there's something I want to try, I can go and they'll take me to any of the specialists on any of the departments. So if it's something about wax, then I can go and talk to the head of wax and talk it through and, let's try this wax, or we could do this, or we might be able to do this. Can you do that? So, and that's what you're not going to get by going to a cheap overseas foundry. You go there because you want to get it cheap. But having somewhere where you can go and you can talk through all the processes, you can access all those specialities, talk to all those technicians, and there's hundreds of people work there. It's an amazing place. It's in Stroud. Yeah, so not too far away. So, and it's just amazing every time I go and visit. I learn something new, I get to try something else out, and and also see other people's work in various stages of production. And they always say, you're not allowed to photograph, no taking pictures.
So what's the place, sorry, in Stroud?
Pangolin Editions. Yeah, so that's the foundry.
My sister lives there.
I think it's in the article in the Boston Target. I think they've mentioned it in there. Any other questions? Oh, yeah.
Have you yourself done traditional, obviously this was very technical and very IT based, but did you start doing traditional bronze work?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and there's not really much difference really. I've always used the direct lost wax technique, so I don't use moulds because my work, if you think back to the beginning of that interest, I like interesting textures and I like things that I can touch, but often what comes with these interesting, intricate textures is it removes the possibility of putting a mould on. So if you try to mould these intricate textures, the mould would go on, it'd never come off. So right at the very beginning, the first sculpture I made, I had to weave in wax because it was not possible to mould my work because there's too many undercuts, too many intricacies. So I actually wove the entire sculpture at full size in wax and cast it that way because then once it was wax, it didn't matter how many intricacies I put in there or undercuts because I didn't have to worry about a mould getting off it because there was no mould. But there's a risk there that if anything goes wrong, you've lost your work. So as I've gone on this journey with pangolin, you know, from that very first hand-woven sculpture that I made, every step along the way I'm like, what if I put this in with it? What if I do this? What if I add knots in it? Can I put linen in it? You know, so I'm constantly asking, you know, the question, well, what else can I cast? Can I do this? Can I do that? What happens if I do this? The great thing about having the digital is that I found doing the own waxwork, I got to a point where I think I'd made quite a few sculptures. I got to one that was 1.2 metre in diameter, and then gravity takes hold of the wax. And then you're constantly fighting against gravity because it's pulling the wax out of shape, because it's soft, it's malleable, it wants to just come down because it gets too heavy. So I'd found a limit of direct weaving in wax was about around a metre before it would start to pull. So having the digital means that I can still hand create, you know, but I'm using textiles and other materials. I don't have to worry about scale because they can scale it for me by using different technologies. So it's given me a lot more freedom, and that's why I've been able to make a pilgrim that can sit on a 1p piece and one that's 6'5". You know, it gives you that ability to scale and make intricate sculptures that wouldn't usually be possible because you can't put a mould on it. You're welcome.
So what do you finish them in? What do you finish them in?
That's a really good question because a lot of people see the sculptures and the colour and they think that they've become that colour from interacting with the environment. But when you think back to that, that's what bronze looks like. That's bronze. It's got, it's about 95% copper. So if you made your sculpture out of bronze, so it's about 95% copper, it's got a bit of tin in it and a few other elements. Every foundry have got their own recipe. But if you then put it outside like that, as soon as it starts to rain, you know what happens if you leave a penny outside? It starts to go verdigris and gets that sort of fairiness. So what you do is add a patination layer. So you've got the sculpture, it's cold, you know, you can touch it now, and it's like a giant eyeshadow palette. There's all these ground pigments of colours. So they spritz a section with water, you tell them what colour you want, and they're dabbling this brush into these powdered pigments and stippling them onto the surface. Then once they've built up a layer, they get a hot blowtorch, run it over, and it seals that pigment onto the surface of the bronze. So then you get a coloured finish, and there's loads of colours that you can use. And then to finish it off, you put on a layer of beeswax. So the beeswax helps to protect that patination, but also interestingly, you may have seen, particularly with historic sculptures, when you see them out that have been there for hundreds of years, they develop shiny patches of like gold patches where people have touched them. So I went to an exhibition called 5,000 Years of Bronze at the Royal Academy, and they've got bronzes from all over the world. And it was really interesting to see which bits people had touched. There was a giant foot and everybody had rubbed the big toe. There was a cherub and you can imagine which bit they'd rubbed. You know, there was faces and they'd rubbed the nose. But what you're doing when you're touching bronzes is you're rubbing off that beeswax and that patina, but we have oils in our hand and you're resealing it with your own oils. So you're revealing that gold colour underneath. So it's a long way of saying that's what you finish them. But it's a really interesting process, is the patination, but then how people interact with the sculpture over its lifespan and how that rubbing away of that patina eventually reveals gold patches of bits that they like to touch. So it'd be interesting to come back, you know, in 10, 20 years and visit all the Pilgrim women and seeing which bit they've rubbed, which is their favourite area to touch.
So you don't actually finish it yourself? It's not.
No,
It's
so
not like a painting.
no.
It's done as part of the mechanical process in the
Yeah.
foundry.
Yeah, so it's that close relationship of going lots of visits,
Yes.
making all those decisions,
Yeah.
but then ultimately it's handed over for the specialists to do, and they're great because they can blend you any colour. I'd like a particular style of colour, which I love the sort of blues and greens, which has become part of my sculptures, but they can be any colour that you like.
There's vertical and horizontal lines on that sculpture, so
Yeah.
what are they?
So that process of segmentation that we talked about, and then put them back together.
Oh, so they're cast separately?
Yeah,
as well,
these
aren't
are all the
they?
bits that've been
Oh,
that have been
okay.
welded, and you can see they've cast my head
Yeah,
in one
separately.
section and welded it back together, and that's why I was so worried about. That's where they put the straps around it on the crane and lifted her off the lorry by her head, because I just thought the head's going to pop off, but it didn't. But yeah, all those lines you see are where they've joined all those different segments.
But do they get rubbed down then, smooth, or do they stay
So
there?
you won't see those at all.
In
So
the-
they're all
in the-
perfectly
yeah.
smooth. If it's an area of texture, like with this, it was like the texture of the wool and the linen fabrics. They can replicate that with their welding styles. So they put that decoration back in where there's weld lines. So the attention to detail is just astonishing. So yeah, it's just amazing to go and see, the foundry and see every step of the process. But each sculpture is different on how many segments. It depends on how complicated they think it might be, or if they think that bit might fail. So if it's a complicated shape, then they might take them smaller, because every time something goes wrong, it's a costly error that they have to fix.
Okay, I think that's probably the end of the questions. Thank you everybody for coming, and I'd just like to say thank you ever so much to Rachel.